Hey everyone, we're going to start. Please take your seats. Hi everyone and welcome to the ISAC Wednesday lecture series. I'm Marc Maillot, the ISAC Museum Director, and it is my pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's lecture, Epigraphy and Exploration at Beni Hasan, Egypt by Anna-Latifa Mourad Cizek, as ISAC Assistant Professor of Egyptian Archaeology and member of the Beni Hasan Project. This lecture is presented in connection with the ISAC Museum Special Exhibition, Chicago on the Nile, 100 Years of the Epigraphic Survey in Egypt, on display until March 23, 2025. And we have the pleasure to have one of the curators of the exhibit in the room, Emily, tonight. The Beni Hasan Cemetery features some of Egypt's most beautifully decorated rock-cut tombs with vibrant painted wall scenes. These tombs, dated to the early Second Millennium BCE, are of major historical importance, and their study is deeply rooted in ISAC's research tradition, as James Breasted initially envisioned documenting their paintings and reliefs as part of the Chicago House Epigraphic Survey. Around a century later, Breasted's vision is embodied through the Beni Hasan Project. Anna-Latifa will introduce epigraphy and exploration at the site in collaboration with the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities and the Australian Centre for Egyptology at Macquarie University. The broader scope of Anna-Latifa's research studies the links between ancient cultural encounters and socio-cultural transformations, and her research has focused on relations between Egypt and Western Asia during the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. She is particularly interested in the processes related to the movement of concepts, objects, and people across geographic, social, and cultural borders, and how these lead to change. Her approach integrates archaeological, textual, and artistic data with current theoretical understandings on social identities, cultural encounters, and sociocultural transformation. Hannah has worked on other archaeological field projects, including at Saqqara on the tomb of Ptahhotep I, and very French, I know, but I'm a bit jealous. Anna's first research monograph based on her PhD, Rise of the Hyksos, Egypt and the Levant from the Middle Kingdom to the early Second Intermediate Period, published in 2015, investigates Egyptian Levantine encounters and how they were tied to the rise of the 15th dynasty. It also reassesses the origins of this dynasty's rulers, the Hyksos, and Egyptian representations of individuals from Egypt's northeast. The impact of the Hyksos and Egyptian relations with Western Asia are then explored in her most recent book, The Enigma of the Hyksos, Volume 2, Transforming Egypt into the New Kingdom, published in 2021. It ascertains how encounters across the Middle to early late Bronze Age influenced socio-political, religious, and technological developments in Egypt as it transitioned from the Middle to the early New Kingdom. Anna's current research examines how communities resiliently adapted to shifting long-distance connectivities across Egypt and Western Asia from the 3rd to the 2nd millennium BCE and to possible early globalization. It seeks to elucidate the links between connectivity, environmental and climatic change, as well as regional and local transformations. Other research interests include network dynamics, funerary arts and architecture, digital epigraphic and archaeological technologies, as well as cultural heritage preservation and promotion. Anna-Latifa's international commitment is demonstrated by her postdoctoral experience, with, as an example, her fellowship at the Institute for Oriental and European Archaeology, Austrian Academy of Sciences, focused on multidirectional cultural interference study, the project called The Enigma of the Hyksos, and her supervisor was Manfred Bitak, European Research Council Advanced Grant Project. And for those of whom who are familiar with Manfred's work, that's saying something. Her multiple awards testifies from the depth and quality of her work since the very beginning of her career, with, in 2009, the University Medal in Ancient History and the Macquarie University Vice Chancellor's Commendation for Outstanding Academic Achievement at the undergraduate level. In 2014-15, Teaching Commendation Award at the School of the Humanities, University of New England, Australia, undergraduate unit on the class Introduction to Egyptian and Near Eastern History. 2019 to 2022, the Macquarie University Research Fellowship Pure Award on the project The Ties That Bind, Negotiating Foreign Relations in the Second Millennium BCE. It will not come as a surprise to all of you, but I would like also to insist on her museum engagement. It's remarkable, with 5 contributions in exhibition catalogs, such as the introduction of the 2023 catalogue of the Discovering Ancient Egypt exhibition, published at the National Museum of Australia Press, Canberra. Her contribution to the daily life section of the catalogue is particularly outstanding, as well as the Journey to the Afterlife introduction, demonstrating her wide range of interests and exhaustive understanding of Egyptian civilization, and her capacity to communicate the most complex concepts to an extended audience. Of particular interest to me, and selfishly, again, I admit, her contribution on hand cartonnage in the 2022 exhibition catalogue, 100 Treasures, 100 Emotions, the Macquarie University History Museum, published at Giles, London, as it is on par with current project at ISAC Museum. And speaking of selfish interest, we will need to talk about the Casmet structure at Avaris at some point. I also would like to insist on an aspect that's not so often emphasized: public and student engagement. Anna-Latifa has demonstrated over her career a deep interest and commitment to communicating the latest state of the art in fundamental research to all audiences. A few examples of interviews and public conversations: 2024, Ramses and the Gold of the Pharaohs public lecture series at the Australian Museum in Sydney; 2022, Digging Ancient Egypt, radio interview at ABC Night Live; 2021, the Ixos, Foreign Kings in Ancient Egypt, podcast interview, Tides of History. And what I'm saying is also applicable to school engagement with, for example, very close, 2024, at the lab school, she gave a tour and talk on ancient Egypt at the ISAC Museum, using the collection for students of year 3. 2023, the Trinity Grammar School, she was invited to give a school talk and a workshop. Finally, her engagements toward the student community is clear. 2022, workshop organizer and host at the Early Career Research Workshop Series, Department of History and Archaeology at Macquarie. 2022 again, panel member, Potential Pathways Career, Teleangels Monitoring Program, again at Macquarie University. 2021, guest panelist for postgraduate units, Arts Internship for Researchers, Faculty of Arts, Macquarie University again. With 3 additional co-authored monographs on the tomb of Khnumhotep, the cemetery of Mer, and Tahotep, 1 co-edited book on daily life in the Old Kingdom, 11 peer-reviewed articles, 9 book chapters, and 4 forthcoming, we have with Anna-Latifa's lecture a special treat tonight, at the forefront of fundamental research in our field. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Anna-Latifa to the stage.
Well, that does not put me under pressure at all. Thank you, Mark, for that very generous and kind introduction. And also, I'd like to say thanks to Kirsten Newman for the invitation to present to you all today. Thank you all also for being here, either in the room or for listening in online. It's both a pleasure and an honor to be giving this lecture to you in association with the ISAC Museum's special exhibition on Chicago on the Nile, which commemorates and appreciates the Epigraphic Survey's contributions to archaeology, Egyptology, history, and cultural heritage. Now, you may wonder, as I did at first, why I'm speaking about Beni Hassan when the exhibition is about the Epigraphic Survey. This will hopefully soon become clearer over the next 50 or 55 minutes as we together explore the site of Beni Hassan and how the lives and desires of the people who lived in its vicinity have been preserved, explored, and recorded over the last few hundred years, drawing interest from this institute's very founder. But first, where and what is Beni Hassan? So to reach the site, we must travel around 250 kilometers south of Cairo, or around 20 kilometers south of El Minya. Here, we will find the village of Beni Hassan, probably named after an Arab tribe, the sons of Hassan, that had settled there on the east bank of the Nile River. Very close by is Beni Hassan al-Qadim, the old or ancient site of Beni Hassan on which we will focus today. Now, upon arrival at that site, we would be confronted with a limestone cliff face and a modern stairway. And as we climb up the stairway, we might miss the hundreds of burials dotting the landscape on either of its side, now mostly covered with sand. Most visitors keep their gaze either to the ground, perhaps as they catch their breath going up that stairway, or they are looking to the end of that climb, the end of that stairway, where they would be met by a row of entryways carved into the limestone, each representing a rock-cut tomb. There are 39 of these on the upper row or terrace, some of which are among Pharaonic Egypt's most famous tombs, and rightly so, with their imposing facades, their high ceilings, their barrel-vaulted roofs, and outstandingly detailed, well-preserved, and colorful wall paintings. The tombs clearly highlight the mastery of Egyptian artists, builders, scribes, and architects. Together with the other burials across the cliff face, this cemetery of Beni Hassan attests to the site's use since at least the late 3rd millennium BCE, or the Old Kingdom. But most of its burials were carved a few hundred years later during the 2nd millennium BCE, the early 2nd millennium BCE, or the Middle Kingdom, offering us very rich insights on the environment, society, and culture of Egypt over 3,800 years ago, and across a critical period in Egyptian history from the Old to the Middle Kingdom, the late 3rd to the early 2nd millennium BCE, that we know was politically unstable, but that also contributed to communities expressing their creativity, aspects of which we will see at Beni Hassan. Now, the cemetery catered the inhabitants of the surrounding region, known at this time as the Oryx district. Select leaders and upper-class individuals of this district were afforded the rock-cut tombs in the upper terrace, while their families and household members and other members of their communities were likely interred in the burials of the lower terrace. Since 2012, I have been working with Beni Hassan as part of a team from Macquarie University's Australian Centre for Egyptology and now the University of Chicago that has been working at the cemetery in cooperation with the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. Under the directorship of Naguib Kanawati, we have been recording the tombs of the upper terrace and investigating their historical and sociocultural significance as well as their history of exploration. Indeed, like many before us, we came from near and far to this region of Egypt. From the very time that the tombs were carved and painted, the immediate families of the tomb owners would have come into the chapels to express their commemoration for those buried within. A few hundred years after that, we also have scenes that attest to the people living there and others coming from further afield that are documented here. And even after that are coming to see the Oryx district, we have Egyptian scribes. And I apologize, that should have come before when I'm telling you who's coming from further afield. For the Egyptian scribes, we have two hieratic inscriptions, if you like, that are shown here, very carefully drawn in between the hieroglyphs, in between the paintings. These graffiti refer to the scribe of excellent fingers Turi, as well as the scribe Khnum Mose, who came to the tomb, and as they described it, it was a temple. The tomb's spacious rooms were later also reused by Coptic monks, who left behind their own inscriptions on the walls and even modified the chapel's architecture for their specific needs. Their inscriptions include crosses that were hatched out onto some of the paintings, as well as Coptic dipinti that referred to members of the Coptic community, as well as other biblical figures. At some point across these thousands of years, the columns of the tomb's facades and chapels were also hacked out and taken away from the site to unknown destinations. So if you do come across any lotiform or 8-sided or 16-sided columns and you don't know where they come from, please get in touch with me as we're trying to figure out where these ended up. Now, such human intervention in the tomb's accessible areas has contributed to the degradation of the chapels and their scenes and inscriptions, combined, of course, with continued exposure to pollutants and other elements. For instance, we find some scenes hacked out, some covered with a thick black soot, and others damaged with a spreading salt incrustation. Early attempts to conserve the paintings unfortunately further dimmed their original colours, though more recent efforts by, for example, the University of Toronto in 1981, as well as by conservators from the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, have aimed to protect them further. Despite these developments, the tombs have attracted the attention of several scholars and non-scholars alike for their significance, their grandeur, and their remarkable details. European visitors to Egypt certainly placed the site on their itinerary in the late 18th to early 19th century and later. The expedition commissioned by Napoleon upon his invasion of Egypt in 1798 included scientists and artists who visited Beni Hassan. Their recordings were published in only a few plates in Volume 2 of the Description de l'Égypte, and I apologize, Mark, if I butcher the French there. These include the architect Charles-Louis Balzac's drawing of their approach to the site and the engineer Jomar's drawings of select architectural elements of the tombs that appear somewhat Hellenized in the publication. These include descriptions and drawings of the pillars, as well as key details of the paintings that he was able to see and easily access, and that he found, and I quote, full of interest and the colors perfectly preserved, close quote. The decades that followed witnessed several European savants, artists, and explorers that visited the site, some of whose notes and drawings contributed to the broader development of epigraphy as we know it today. To name a few, they include James Burton, who later co-published one of the earliest compilations of hieroglyphic text that was later sent to Europe for possible people to decipher, the curator of the Natural History Museum of Nantes, Frédéric Caillot, as well as the Scottish antiquarian Robert Hay, who hired artists to record the paintings and monuments he visited between 1824 and 1838, including the sculptor and draftsman Joseph Bonomi. The two were among the first to use one-to-one semi-transparent tracings to note colors at Thebes, and as we see in the central image there on the screen, also at Beni Hassan, where it seems they tested and used the camera lucida to record the two largest and most well-preserved tombs at the site, those of Khnumhotep II and Amenemhat. This device was quite new for its time, and it used a prism on an adjustable stand to superimpose what was being viewed, like a wall painting, if you like, onto a drawing surface. So as the artist draws what he sees, he can also follow that with what he sees on the wall as well as the screen before him. You can also tell in their drawings that they did record the hieroglyphic texts. However, there are considerable errors in these texts. The texts of the tombs at Beni Hassan received greater attention from Jean-François Champollion, who in 1822 claimed the decipherment of the script. Between 1828 and 1829, he was involved in a joint Franco-Tuscan expedition to Egypt with Ippolito Rossellini that included a visit to Beni Hassan. Champollion produced his numbering of some of the Upper Terrace's tombs, adding hitherto unpublished details on their inscriptions and scenes. He also applied his novel approach to translating the hieroglyphic script to try to identify the tomb owners and the periods in which they lived, offering early translations of their names, such as Nevoth for Khnumhotep and Menoph for Amenemhat, as we would read it today. The resulting publication made available more details of the tomb's scenes, a few even painted in color to show the vibrant patterns that were observed. These, however, as you can see, were fragmented from their original wall context, so there's no way of knowing the registers in which scenes this particular details come from. Now, around 13 years later, another team came to record the site, this time as part of the Royal Prussian expedition to Egypt between 1842 and 1845 to 46. This was led by Carl Richard Lepsius. Susanna Binder has recently published the diary of one of the members of the team, perhaps one of the youngest members of the team, Max Weidenbach, who notes his impressions on the first day that they visited Beni Hassan, Wednesday, like today, but the 30th of August, 1843. As he writes, it was a laborious 10-minute walk up the cliff, which I would say is a very similar experience for anyone who would visit the site today. As they reached the top, the group enjoyed the beautiful view of the Nile Valley in the morning sun, and then they entered one of the tombs, which Max Weidenbach described, and again, warning here if I butcher the German for all German speakers, einen großartigen, einfachen, geschmackvollen Tempel, durch Menschenhände entstanden, ausgehöhlt. So, to translate, a magnificent, simple, tasteful temple carved out by human hands or hollowed out. The word temple here fascinatingly mirrors how the ancient Egyptian scribe had also described these sacred spaces. After walking the stretch of the upper terrace, the group then returned to those two largest tombs, those of Khnumhotep II and Amenemhat, and then they started to draw. They spent the next 2 weeks documenting the scenes and inscriptions of these selected tombs, offering yet another numbering system for them that were made by their architect Erkbam. In just 16 days, the team was able to trace this chapel of Khnumhotep II, using, I would say, the camera lucida as well. The copy of the wall scenes by Max's brother Ernst were used to make then reduced lithographs that were colored according to their notes. And then these lithographs were not only useful as a template for the Lepsius publication from which you see these plates. So this comes from the Denkmale aus Ägypten und Äthiopien, but they were also used for large format reproductions on cardboard and paper. These reproductions then formed the basis of an enlarged replica of the chapel scenes that was reconstructed for the World Exhibition in Vienna in 1873. And following this exhibition, they were then moved to the Egyptian galleries for the then newly opened Kunsthistorisches Museum in the city. And since its opening in 1891, these paintings from Beni Hassan have decorated its walls, which I have had the pleasure to visit during my 3-year stay in the city. The allure of Beni Hassan did not stop there. After the Franco-Tuscan and Prussian expeditions, the British now wanted to document the site. The co-founder of the Egypt Exploration Fund, Amelia Edwards, even writes the main reasons that drew them to this part of Egypt. As we can see, she notes that the earlier expeditions by Champollion, Rossellini, Wilkinson, and Lepsius that had visited Egypt, they had found paintings very well preserved, and yet they only selected details to copy from these tombs. As she writes, these were of comparatively little value, and for purposes of serious study, no Egyptian monument could possibly yield its full measure of instruction unless it was copied as a whole. She also notes that the new expedition was a practical protest against the unchecked and barbarous damage that had been done to the historic monuments of Beni Hassan, suggesting that between the Prussian expedition and the late 19th century, something must have occurred at the site at Beni Hassan and the region around it. As such, she very much promoted the Archaeological Survey of Egypt, which was established in 1891 with the first site of its focus being Beni Hassan. This was led by the Egyptologist Percy E. Newberry, whom you see in the left photo there at the center back, and his team was able to document more systematically than before the upper terrace tombs. They worked for 3 seasons between 1890 and 1893, using one of the tombs, tomb number 16, as their quarters, and they published their results in 4 volumes that included a general plan of the site with the numbering that we now still follow, architectural plans of the renumbered tombs that were also surveyed and drawn by Fraser, their description, translations of the texts, and reproductions of the scenes. Now, when it comes to these reproductions, Newberry writes that they were now based on full-size tracings or hand copies that were made on the spot. For the tracings, the decorated surfaces would be covered with tracing paper, upon which paintings were then outlined in pencil. In a letter that he writes to Francis Griffith, he goes into detail about this process, but what's interesting is that he also writes that to trace everything in detail would take years and I am sure is not worth it, which was already contradicting what Amelia Edwards had written also in 1891. With the tracings of the selected or completed scenes, these were then sent to London at the end of each season where the tracings were inked in, with some figures also filled in black. The inking was often completed by artists who had not seen nor had access to the originals. The full-sized ink drawings were then reduced by lithography to 1/20th of their original size for publication, leading to plates such as the one that you see for select tombs that contained the scenes of either entire walls in this format or selected parts of walls also in this format. So this entire process was thus prone to mistakes. Even for the tomb of Khnumhotep II, and I'm showing you here the east wall of this very large and beautiful tomb in the drawing based on Newberry, Griffith, only a few years later after its publication, writes that the tomb is very inadequately represented in the plates in volume 1 of the Beni Hasan series. It would be an enormous labor to trace or otherwise copy these scenes accurately. For this tomb, they had to rely on the imperfect small-scale copies of Hay and Lepsius and to construct them then from rough outlines for publications. However, if we were to compare one half of this wall with the Lepsius publication, we'd also spot differences. For instance, you can probably see that the details that Lepsius had in the publication, likely drawn by Ernst Weidenbach, are much more detailed than what appears in Newberry's publication. Just have a look, for instance, at the birds and the butterflies above the marsh. An additional critique of the recordings was noted by another team member who joined Newberry in 1891, and I'm sure you're all familiar with his name. Howard Carter, at that age, was 17 years old and he joined the expedition as an artist or a tracer. And he commented at that young age that the epigraphic method had failed to capture anything of the sense of the artistry of painters responsible, treating the wall instead merely as media for conveying information. Such artistry was instead applied by Carter as by other artists in the team, like Blackton, to produce watercolors like these that still grace the pages of publications today on pharaonic Egyptian art. A few years after Newberry and his team had finished their work, his friend and colleague, John Garstang, who was actually trained as a mathematician, led a team to Beni Hasan. But this time, the focus was not on the upper terrace. The main objective was to search for other burials, and Garstang was guided by two main aspects for this goal. First, he knew from other cemeteries that tombs of the elite were usually surrounded by those of other officials. And secondly, he could also see that there were very visible graves already apparent along the cliff face. So, in 2 winter seasons, between 1902 to 1904, the team surveyed and partially excavated the lower terrace, the plan of which you see there on the screen, with all the black dots in the lower half. Each of these represents a burial. So they found at least 888 burials that comprise rock-cut tombs, like those that you see on the screen of Ipi and Bebi that date to the late 3rd millennium BCE, burials with shafts that led to one or more underground chambers, as well as simple shaft burials like those we see clustered here. From these, at least 4,000 objects, or rather, according to Garstang's publication, 4,000 pottery objects, were excavated, and you can see some of this pottery strewn across the cliff face. Over 2,000 of these were dispersed to various museums around the world under the partage system. The details about this excavation and its finds were then published in 1907 in only one book, which, from its singular publication, you can probably already deduce the degree of detail that it contained on the, again, 888 burials with over 4,000 objects that were excavated in only 2 seasons. The book at least contained an appendix with an inventory, albeit an incomplete one, of the objects and the tombs. As for any inscriptions, Garstang himself notes in the preface that texts were not published in full as the complete copies of these would fill a volume by themselves. The book at least did contain names and titles that were recorded by Newberry when he visited the site in 1903, and also collated by Howard Carter for the publication. And this list suggests that the people buried here did include officials in the local community's administration as well as their families. Other very important material, like the so-called coffin texts painted on many of the coffins found at the site, were then incorporated into later publications, and both the coffins as well as the coffin texts are currently under study by several researchers across the world. Now, while the book lacked in such detail, it did contain many photographs taken on site. These include some of what I'm showing you now, which come from the University of Liverpool's archives, and for which I would like to thank here Marisol Solchaga, who has been studying the photos and Garstang's excavations at the site as part of the Beni Hassan Project. From these, we can see how the tombs of the upper terrace were yet again used as the headquarters for Garstang's team. This is, I think, the same tomb, even tomb number 16 that Newberry had used earlier. As Garstang describes them, they were airy and comfortable quarters, and this is also very similar to how Carter and Newberry had described them. Garstang also records how an underground chamber served as a dark room, and to his credit, he mentions and names an Arab boy, Mahmoud Abdel Galal, who developed more than 1,000 negatives, very likely of the photos that we are now looking at. Garstang also gives credit to the workmen who excavated the many burials at Beni Hassan and who also accompanied him on other field projects, noting that they took a very intelligent interest in the excavation. He also names the Reyes, Salah Abd Nabi of Awidat, and he says that this Reyes was a loyal and constant helper in many seasons' arduous work. And in fact, when I was going through around 1,000 photos of the negatives, I could see that most of them that were taken on the cliff face involved the Arab workmen, perhaps even Salah Abd Nabi, whereas Garstang was usually shown in the quarters in tomb number 16. Now, around the same time that this was happening, another Egyptologist from across the ocean was launching his own expedition of the Nile Valley. His name, with which many of you are familiar, is James Henry Breasted, the founder of this institute, who, between 1905 to 1907, was conducting his epigraphic expedition to Nubia while planning for a larger project to copy not merely the historical, but all the inscriptions of Egypt and to publish them. Around 2 decades later, and just over 100 years ago, in May 1924, the Epigraphic Survey was launched. And as many of you know, and as methodically documented by Emily Teeter in the volume relating to ISAC's special exhibition on Chicago on the Nile, Breasted's vision for the survey was very ambitious. He had planned for it to document the temples of Thebes, including those of Karnak, Luxor, Medinat Habu, and the Ramesseum. But Breasted also wanted to expand the survey to other areas along the Nile Valley. And of course, as with the major European epigraphic expeditions of the 19th and early 20th century that we had just seen, he may have had his eyes on the upper terrace tombs at Beni Hassan. Breasted was familiar with Newberry's work. In October 1924, he sent a letter to Harold Hayden Nelson, who had only that May become the Epigraphic Survey's first field director. And here I also would like to thank Emily Teeter for this letter and all details of the correspondence between Nelson and Breasted about Beni Hassan. So the letter discusses the format of the Temple series publications and the selection of their page size to determine the scale at which the temple inscriptions would be published. And in doing so, Breasted referred to this plate from Newberry's publication, taken from the tomb of Amenemhat. And he highlighted the glyphs in the upper rows for the potential scale in the series publications. In February 1925, Nelson planned a visit to Beni Hassan as per this telegram sent to Breasted, hinting perhaps that maybe Breasted would like to join if he could take some relaxation, otherwise he seems to be a very busy man, understandably so. So perhaps this visit was to see the true scale of the paintings and check their details for another important part of the epigraphic survey, which was its epigraphic method. In developing the Chicago House method, Breasted and Nelson likely consulted the epigraphic process that was used at Beni Hassan, with its one-to-one copying using tracing paper. They possibly also realized the disadvantages of the reduced scale of the Beni Hasan scenes to 1/20th of their original size, and the blacked out figures as published by Newberry, which failed to capture the details that would be required by the epigraphic survey. Although Newberry produced these in only 2 to 3 seasons, the process may have also been too slow for Breasted, who inevitably favoured photography as well as tracing to record the reliefs of the temple inscriptions and their scenes. According to a letter that Breasted sent to Nelson in 1930, interests in Beni Hasan apparently extended to John D. Rockefeller Jr., who had greatly funded the survey's work. Such interests appear in association with another larger project that Breasted wanted to promote, which was to document and reproduce wall paintings in color, possibly as part of the publication titled Masterpieces of Egyptian Painting, which was planned with the Egypt Exploration Society's Alan H. Gardner. Breasted wanted to discuss this further with Nelson, but whether or not this transpired is uncertain. Instead, we have a resulting publication of the discussions with Gardner that appeared under a different title, Ancient Egyptian Paintings by Nina M. Davies. The 3-volume publication, which was also funded by Rockefeller Jr., included paintings from sites along the Egyptian Nile Valley, among which are 5 beautifully colored artworks, 2 of which you're seeing on the screen, of selected scenes from the tomb of Khnumhotep II. The selections came from one tomb because, according to Davies, the paintings in the other tombs were not as exceptional. She describes them as careless and coarse, grotesque and crude, somber and rather provincial in comparison to paintings with the Theban tombs, from which the publication had otherwise significant artwork copies. With this publication, any further plans to document the paintings at Beni Hasan by Breasted or Nelson do not seem to have come to fruition, at least as far as I could find so far. So instead, the 1893 publications by Newberry on the Upper Terrace tombs and the 1907 publication by Garstang on the Lower Terrace burials, with all their pros and cons, became the main published documentation on the cemetery at Beni Hasan, until, that is, 2014, when the first volume of a new Beni Hasan series was published. This series is a product of the Beni Hassan Project led by Naguib Ganawati to re-explore and re-record the cemetery in view of broader research questions on approaches to funerary art, as well as socio-political and cultural changes between the 3rd to 2nd millennium BCE. This work has been made possible with the financial support of the Australian Research Council and the Rundle Foundation for Egyptian Archaeology, as well as the Australian Centre for Egyptology so far. Now, unlike the 2 weeks of Lepsius' team, or the 2 to 3 seasons that Newberry's team took to record the tombs, it has taken the Beni Hassan Project team around 15 years to complete the documentation of 9 decorated tombs of the Upper Terrace and 2 decorated tombs of the Lower Terrace, with 7 volumes of the Beni Hassan series now published, among several additional articles and book chapters that are too many for me to go through today. Now, this work would not have been possible without the expertise and assistance of many collaborators on and off-site, some of whose contributions appear in these volumes. Importantly, it would not have been possible without the generosity and cooperation of the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. Across the seasons, we've been accompanied by inspectors of antiquities who spared no effort in facilitating our work, and we have also relied on a very skilled local team to help with the on-site excavation, with the Reyes for our first few years being the Hag Faisal, and in more recent years, his son, Ali Faisal. To re-record the tombs, we have focused then on 3 main elements, including documentation of their architecture, which often required clearing some chapels and shafts and porticos, any remains that were uncovered in the process, as well as re-recording paintings and inscriptions. The excavation and recording often occurred simultaneously, but in different tombs or different parts of tombs, as some of these tombs were still left open for visitors from both nearby, around Beni Hasan and Minya, as well as from further afield. Now, immediately when the project had started, it was clear that each of these elements was incompletely and, in many cases, erroneously documented by Newberry and his team. So for that reason, the architecture, for example, had to be re-recorded with measurements newly taken on site, as we see here by a dedicated lead architect, Naguib Victor, who has also trained students from Macquarie University, as well as trainee inspectors of antiquities on how to take architectural measurements on site. Shafts, especially those that were not documented by Newberry, had to be re-cleared, with some extending to over 79 feet, or if you're like me and are more familiar with the metric system, around 24 to 25 meters deep. The burial apartment of the tomb of Barket II, for example, was not recorded nor described in Newberry's publications, despite its very interesting architecture as well as its very rare paintings in the burial chamber that you can see in the image there that included actually inscriptions of pyramid texts. Now, once all measurements were then or are then taken, the architectural plans are then drawn and inked off-site with the resulting drawing of that tomb shaft that I had just showed you on the screen. During the reclearing of shafts like this, as well as chapels, we'd also come across human remains, pottery remains, as well as other small finds. Analyses of the skeletal remains of 3 individuals have thus far been conducted and published by Dr. Zainab Hashesh and Dr. Michael Schulz, and what they found is that the remains had already been disturbed, which we could see from the archaeological material and context, suggesting that Newberry's team had already come across them and then reburied them either in the shafts or the burial chambers. 2 of these skeletal remains are from the tomb of Keti, one belonging to a male in his 30s, between 35 to 39 years of age, presumably Keti himself, and he was of relatively good health, and the other was probably of a male younger than him, between 20 to 34 years of age, and it's been suggested that this might have been Keti's son. They would have been originally, as we have reconstructed, buried in 2 separate chambers and shafts in 2 separate tombs, but then with the re-excavation of that shaft by Fraser and perhaps others in antiquity, they were then buried within the same chamber. The third set of remains were found in that burial chamber that I had shown you earlier of Barket II, and these belong to a male, presumably again of Barket himself, between 25 to 35 years of age. These remains show evidence that he was likely involved in heavy physical activity. Maybe an activity like the one that you see in his tomb, although this is not for certain, of course, it's just one of many possible activities that Barket might have been involved in. And in fact, his remains showed that he was healing from fractures on his skull, as well as his left fibula next to the tibia, and he did have osteoarthritis, and combined with other details that we know both from his tomb as well as other tombs at Beni Hassan and the period to which he is dated, around the very early Second Millennium BCE, it's been suggested that he was involved in military activities or training. Now, the pottery that was found across the years has been studied so far by ceramicists Ashraf Senussi and Iman Khalifa, and it includes vessels from the late 3rd millennium BCE found in the lower terrace tomb, and vessels from the 2nd millennium BCE found thus far in the upper terrace tombs. For instance, in that same burial apartment that I had mentioned to you earlier in Barket II's tomb, we have this very beautiful pottery assemblage that was found and published in 2022. It was disturbed at some point in antiquity with vessels smashed and separated from their mud stoppers and contents, but we are very fortunate that some of them were still found in the chambers. As for the other finds that the team had come across, not all date to the Pharaonic period. When clearing a shaft in the tomb of Khnumhotep II, for example, these notes were found placed in a bottle, written by Newberry and members of his team in 1891, with Newberry even quoting a line from Shakespeare's play Troilus and Cressida, spoken by Ulysses as he describes Nestor as someone instructed in the antiquary times. He must, he is, he cannot, but be wise. Perhaps Newberry's way of describing people who specialize in studies on the past. Now, from the architecture, finds, and remains to now the scenes and the texts. Different epigraphic methods have been applied at Beni Hassan. Initially, in the very first few years, the team had focused on one-to-one tracings for the well-preserved and the larger tombs, again, those of Khnumhotep II and Amenemhat, and we would, of course, use different lighting and scaffolding and ladders to reach and record the texts and scenes. These were then inked by our lead epigrapher and draftsman Sameh Shafiq, after which the sheets were sent back to Sydney, where at that time I was responsible for scanning and digitally stitching them, and then also reducing them to scale for publication. Yes, this was very time consuming, but the degree of preservation in the larger tombs allowed us to bring the documentation up to modern standards. So that's the tomb that I had shown you earlier, the wall in which we were recording just a few slides ago. And I chose this just to select a few details for you in comparison with earlier recordings of the tomb of Khnumhotep II. So if, for example, we're going to zoom in on one of the boats, we would notice greater detail in the sails, in the ropes, in the figures, as well as the surrounding hieroglyphs. The sails themselves are very different in how we were able to render them in our facsimiles. Moving to the register below, we have two trees that I've selected here for you. One a vine, and next to it is a common fig tree. In Newberry's drawing, you can make out that there are three figures by the vine, but we were able to capture what the artist had drawn with the figures integrating with the foliage as if they're coming through from under the leaves themselves. And with the fig next to it, Newberry did not, or the publication did not record the baboons, even though Davy's recordings of this scene very clearly show these beautifully colored baboons that we were also able to incorporate into our own facsimile. Across this wall is the east wall that I've shown you across the slides of this presentation. And the central panel of this east wall at the top is Khnumhotep II on the clapnet scene as represented here. And I'll also say here that all of our facsimiles, black and white line drawings, are supplemented and complemented by these photographs. So if anyone's interested and of course wants to study the artistic brushstrokes, for example, the color and the details, they can also see the photographs themselves. So I'm going to use the photograph here to compare it with the earlier recordings as well. Looking at the one published by Lepsius, we would note that it was very close to the photograph, to the original, or what's preserved of it, with, for instance, the water, the birds, and the two trees that we see there. If we focus on these elements and have a look at the publication in Newberry, we'd notice that the water has been taken out. Only a few details of one of the trees is also shown. Looking at our line drawing, you can also tell that we were able to bring those elements back to preserve what's already been slightly damaged in the tomb itself and to keep that record of it. Zooming into one of the trees, again with the photograph that's published in the report on the tomb, we'd notice in comparison with Davy's painting that it's very close to what we see in the tomb itself. The missing details are the context, the importance of studying this tree in comparison with the rest of that clapnet and the hieroglyphs around it and the entire east wall. And this is what was also supplied in our record of the tomb. It included the line drawing with the detail as well as the surrounding elements, such as the hieroglyphs themselves, also beautifully painted and detailed in their representations. The second tree, which has received very little attention, is also equally vibrant in detail as we see here. Now, the line drawings of the tomb of Khnumhotep II, I am very proud to say and happy to say, were very well received in Egypt. They have been now incorporated into a special display at the new Grand Egyptian Museum in Giza. I will only show you the signage here, and I will only say that when I visited the museum back in January with students from the University of Chicago, I was utterly surprised and overjoyed to see our line drawings beautifully brought to life in both color and animation at this museum. I would also say that when our lead epigrapher, Sameh Shafiq, saw a recording of the display, he was almost brought to tears to see the inkings that he so tirelessly worked on for several seasons showcased at Giza. Now, the tomb of Khnumhotep II remains very well preserved. But what about the other not so well preserved wall paintings? In the course of the years, we have trialed to various degrees of success the image enhancement software dstretch. dstretch is a plugin for the open source program ImageJ that was developed by John Harmon to help clarify elements in rock paintings that were near invisible to the naked eye. Its applications have since broadened, with archaeologists around the world, including those in Egypt, as at Beni Hassan, using it to improve the intensity and saturation of RGB colors or to stretch their contrast to make it easier to see differences between them. By using dstretch, we were able to reveal and confirm unclear details in the paintings and improve our line drawings. Examples include this pig herd, which, when drawn on site, only had 2 bores. But with dstretch, we were able to confirm that a third little piglet was painted there under the larger bore. And this process of applying dstretch at the site has now been published in an article co-authored by Linda Evans and me in the Journal of Archaeological Science. dstretch also proved to be very useful when we were recording the tomb of Khnumhotep I, not Khnumhotep II that I've been repeating across this lecture, but rather the older tomb of Khnumhotep I. The paintings for this tomb are very heavily faded. Newberry himself describes the west wall, the south end of the west wall, for example, as being very destroyed to copy even. The top of this wall includes several rows of hieroglyphs that are actually the biography of Khnumhotep I, and that Newberry did do a very good job in recording for our purposes today. The lower half, however, he left not recorded at all or undocumented. When we returned to the scene and we used dstretch and a lot of hours with my co-field director Miral Lachine and I standing at this wall and trying to see what there is, we were able to record the following on the screen. And I'm only going to zoom in on one particular detail here, even though the rest is equally as intriguing. This spearfishing scene of the tomb owner, Khnumhotep I, where he stands on a boat with 4 women. His wife is likely standing behind him, and 3 of his daughters stand between his legs. One of these is his beloved daughter, Barket. The name Barket otherwise appears in Khnumhotep II's tomb, the larger tomb, and it's mentioned as the mother of Khnumhotep II. So this has now confirmed our suspicions that Khnumhotep II is the grandson of Khnumhotep I. So it's these types of details that have also helped us reconstruct the familial relations and the datings of the tombs at Beni Hassan. Going from the west wall to the east wall, Newberry also commented on this east wall, and he said that the paintings here are also much mutilated. The fragmentary scenes that he gave on plate 47 are all that can now be traced from them. I've given you the photo here. This is plate 47 from Newberry's publication, with various details placed in these registers. When we went back to the wall, we noticed that these details are actually not in any clear sequence. They only represent around 20% of the entire wall that we were able to copy. The wall itself, in the upper registers, we have rows of men in wrestling positions, and in the lower registers, the left half is dominated by a siege scene. The right half has the details that most of the details that Newberry had published. So I've color-coded them here for you so you can see how he was whoever recorded this compiled that plate that appears in Newberry's publication. Focusing on 2 details here, and I would have to say these are because I'm very fascinated in these details. We have this particular group that are shown walking away from the scene, and I argue that they are actually not related to the siege scene at all. This is why the context was so important to be able to make that proposition. Looking at their details, Newberry also noted their details very well, and we were able to enhance these with specific details on, for example, the necklaces that the men wear. Based on these details, this group very likely came from the west of the Nile Valley. They were foreigners. And it is details like the necklace that I am very much interested in to see possibly why the Egyptians chose to represent these foreigners that way, and perhaps if we can identify this representation. I suspect that maybe this spiral necklace that the men are wearing could perhaps be a shell or a representation of a shell. Going back to the east wall, to the lower register of the entire wall, highlighted in purple, are 4 men that I've highlighted there. Well, actually 5 in our Newberry recording. Newberry had only drawn 4. The last man in Newberry's recording carrying the bow is the last man on that bottom register. I'm only focusing on the 4 men in front of him. If we go through to the detail, we'll find an additional man that Newberry did not include in the publication. Again, what's interesting for me in studying representations of foreigners are the details here. Like the first man that stands in this group, who, as confirmed by D-Stretch, is very clearly wearing a one-shouldered garment that is otherwise worn by individuals of high status in Western Asia. And notice also the type of axe that he is carrying, also common at the time for people from Western Asia. So in trying to identify why these individuals were copied in this earlier tomb of Khnumhotep I, it is these details again and their context that would be important for researchers like me, as they were for me. So, since working then at the tomb of Khnumhotep I, our epigraphic methods clearly had to adapt to the faded paintings. It was also at this time that the Egyptian ministry wanted teams to stop using direct one-to-one tracings. So we did adapt by incorporating elements of our initial epigraphic method and also adapting the Chicago house method in terms of documenting the paintings rather than reliefs by photographing the walls methodically with a good degree of overlap and good lighting, making sure, of course, to avoid distortion when we do so. The photos are then printed all to the same scale for us to trace the paintings both off-site and on-site, checking details on-site and against photographs as we had gone along. All the while, Sameh Shafiq has been able to train others as well in epigraphy. The same high-resolution photographs could also then be passed through D-Stretch or other image-enhancing software to check certain details, and the resulting drawings are then inked carefully off-site for digital scanning in Egypt rather than in Australia. Again, making our process much more efficient. Of course, with that comes the final publications, with all that I've just mentioned contributing to this series. With work now being completed on the decorated tombs and some already published, you might be thinking, what's left to explore at Beni Hasan? Our focus is now shifting towards the undecorated tombs at the south part of the upper terrace that show very unique architectural features, as well as unexplored questions that have arisen in the course of the past decade, especially within the last few years. Unfortunately, I cannot yet tell you the details, which is why I should keep informed about the Beni Hasan project, hopefully in lectures, through lectures like this. But just 2 months ago, when I was at the site, we were once again looking at the wall paintings in search for some clues to help us with what was found. The team has also been turning its attention to the lower terrace, with Marisol Solchaga already taking on the mammoth task of tracking down the thousands of objects from its burials that have been dispersed to various institutions worldwide, with the aim to reconstruct the burial assemblages and to learn more about the people buried there. Her findings thus far emphasize the unique funerary practices of the inhabitants of Beni Hasan surrounding communities, glimpses of which were hinted at in Garstang's publication. They have also highlighted the need for further research on the lower terrace and the site as a whole to clarify and enhance our understandings of how surrounding communities used, modified, and continued to modify the landscape not only in the Pharaonic period but also afterwards. So going against, if you like, Davies's description or using that description of this art as being provincial, I would like to think that it's because it's so-called provincial that we have such unique pieces of art that come from Beni Hasan. This community welcomed creative artists that allowed, for example, for someone to paint another individual standing on his head, or a woman suckling her child in a musical scene, or perhaps jugglers, which is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, detail of jugglers that I could find also in Egyptian art. This creativity also lends credit to the keen observers, the Egyptians, of their environment and the world around them. And again, some details here of both real creatures as well as fantastical creatures that appear in completely unusual contexts. For instance, this griffin, female griffin, that seems to have a collar. The image that I give you above there is of a painting of an artist in this lecture about explorers, recording artists. So I just thought it was a nice way to put it as the very final image, for the paintings at least, about Beni Hasan. So I personally think that there's much left to investigate at the site. The cemetery was sacred for those buried in it, offering them protection for what they envisioned to be their passage to another realm, and offering members of their communities the ability to reach them and perhaps commemorate their lives and achievements of those who had passed and those who had passed through and visited the Oryx district. The tombs continued to attract visitors, scribes, monks, and many others who were living in the area or passing by, realizing the site's uniqueness. The surge in European interest in Egypt's past then witnessed almost every major expedition sent along the Nile Valley in the 19th and early 20th centuries to head to Beni Hasan, including the French antiquarians who noted their visit during Napoleon's occupation of Egypt, the Franco-Tuscan expedition, the Prussian expedition, the British Archaeological Survey of Egypt, and for a brief moment, even Chicago House's first field director, who may or may not have discussed documenting the site with this institute's founder. Over a century later, the Beni Hassan Project team was granted the opportunity to work at the site, focusing not only on its past remains, but also its continued significance for the history, archaeology, and heritage for Egypt. And I hope that with my involvement now as part of ISAC, that Breasted's possible vision can be materialized, and I look forward to continuing this work at Beni Hassan as part of the Beni Hassan Project team, with thanks to all of you for your time across the past hour as we together ventured to the site of Beni Hasan. Thank you.